3 years after a landmark anti-stalking law took effect in Taiwan, advocates say there's still more to do to keep people safe.
第一点，跟骚也要有紧急保护令；第二点，跟骚受害者的资料需要保护；第三，加害人要接受教育辅导。
U.S. President Donald Trump says Israel and Iran have reached a ceasefire, but continued strikes suggest peace may still be a way off. Plus, changes to the priority seating on Taiwan's public transportation with the goal to give a wider range of people the chance to sit when they need to. Welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Yvonne Young. It's been 3 years since Taiwan's anti-stalking law took effect, but victims' advocates say some people are still living in fear. They say the law needs updating to close gaps that leave people exposed. Now, one lawmaker says she has a plan. John Van Trieste reports.
跟骚立法3周年，保护还要更完善，保护还要更完善。
Ms. A's life is derailed. For 2 years, she's been followed and threatened by a coworker whose advances she rejected. Her stalkers spread her personal information online and even broken into her house. Taiwan's anti-stalking law hasn't stopped the harassment. Despite a written warning from police and a court-issued protection order, she lives in hiding. And even here, giving pre-recorded testimony today, with her voice changed, she appears with a mask, sunglasses, and a low hat to guard her privacy.
法律到底是保护被害者还是保护加害者呢？我觉得是保护加害者。
It's now exactly 3 years since the Stalking and Harassment Prevention Act took effect, and victims' advocates say it's helped close to 9,000 victims get help from police. But the question of how many cases like Ms. A's remain, undetected or just brushed off, is something that concerns them. One issue, from a lawyer's view, is that the law says the crime must be, quote, sexual or gender-related, conflating two issues and opening a loophole some only realize is there when they try to report stalking behavior.
我们之前曾经遇过非常多人哦，他去到警察局跟警察说，指责他说他一直跟着我，警察告诉他说抱歉，我们没有办法处理这个问题，这个行为也不是性骚扰，跟着你也不是性骚扰。
But there's at least one chance to close those loopholes and offer more effective protection to stalking victims. Lawmaker Fan Yun says she's drawing up a bill to do just that. She says it will have the government rethink the need for a sexual harassment threshold so no one is left behind. And there's more.
第一点，跟骚也要有紧急保护令；第二点，跟骚受害者的资料需要保护；第三，加害人要接受教育辅导。 以上这3个诉求，家暴法都可以做到，所以跟骚法也应该要修法做到。
From Ms. A to lawmaker Fan Yun to the lawyer and the activists here today, the hope is the same, making sure a 3-year-old law succeeds in its original mission to get justice for people who would otherwise have their lives destroyed. Alex Chen and John Van Trieste for TaiwanPlus.
New Taipei prosecutors have indicted 31 people for forging names on lawmaker recall petitions. The campaigns targeted legislators from the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. All 3 failed to progress to a public vote. Prosecutors say the suspects faked over 2,500 signatures on their petitions. Lawmakers are cracking down on workplace bullying in government offices, with changes to the law protecting civil servants from mistreatment. It comes after the suicide of a civil servant last year, a death that shocked the country. The amended law provides definitions of bullying, and it outlines hefty fines for senior officials who either bully their staff or fail to stop bullying if they know it's going on. The fines are now as high as $34,000. The amendments would take effect 6 months after they are formally announced. The U.S. House of Representatives has unanimously passed a bill supporting Taiwan's inclusion in the International Monetary Fund. The bill, called the Taiwan Non-Discrimination Act, asks the U.S. to advocate Taiwan's participation in the financial organization. Representative Young Kim, who sponsored the bill, says IMF membership would help Taiwan strengthen its financial resilience and resist China's economic coercion. The bill still needs Senate approval before it can be signed into law by the president. Hope for peace in the Middle East. U.S. President Donald Trump is claiming that all sides in the recent conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran agreed to a ceasefire. But as missiles continue to fly, the state of that ceasefire remains far from certain. Chris Gorin reports.
The moment an Iranian missile strikes an apartment building in southern Israel. It left at least 6 dead and 15 injured. It was one of a series of missile exchanges between Iran and Israel before the two sides appeared to agree to a short-lived ceasefire. The previous night, Iran launched missiles at the U.S. military. The Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, one of the largest U.S. bases in the region, was the target. Iran says it's retaliation for the U.S. joining Israel's strikes on its nuclear facilities on Sunday. U.S. officials report 13 out of 14 missiles were intercepted, and no injuries were reported. Qatar condemned the attack.
The state of Qatar condemns in the strongest terms the Iranian missile attack on the Qatari Al Udeid Air Base. This attack represents a flagrant violation of Qatar's sovereignty and contravenes the principles of good neighborliness.
U.S. President Donald Trump downplayed the attack, however, even thanking Iran for warning the U.S. before the strikes, later saying that Israel and Iran had agreed to a ceasefire to be implemented within 24 hours. But Iran seemed to dispute Trump's claim. Its foreign minister, currently in Moscow for talks with Russia, said that no ceasefire was agreed to, but left open the possibility of one if Israel ceases its attacks. Some in Iran celebrated the attack on the U.S. and called for more.
We aren't satisfied with the number of missiles fired. It was too few. We want the Iranian armed forces to fire many more. All the Americans in the Middle East, all their military personnel should be sent back in coffins. And in my opinion, it was far too few.
While the ceasefire appeared to be holding by the afternoon, just hours later, Israel said Iran launched new strikes, breaking the deal, which Iran denies. But with both sides pointing the finger, the fate of the fragile ceasefire is in question, while the region braces for what's next. Patrick Chun and Chris Gorin for TaiwanPlus.
Taiwanese visitors to Brunei can now enter the country visa-free for up to 14 days. The visa waiver was first announced on social media by Taiwan's foreign minister, who welcomed it as a milestone in Taiwan-Brunei ties. News comes just days after the Philippines granted Taiwanese travelers visa-free entry. Taiwan passport holders can now visit over 100 countries and territories without a visa, including 5 Southeast Asian nations. A top domestic think tank says Taiwan's business climate declined in May. The Taiwan Institute of Economic Research says global uncertainties, including energy, are weighing on the country's major industries.
只要霍姆兹海峡没有封起来，没有封起来，其实对原油的影响就没有那么大。包括卡达的天然气啦，包括伊朗啊、阿曼啊，他们的那些油就可以运出来。
Indicators for the manufacturing sector have fallen for 4 straight months to a 2-year low. The services and construction sectors also continue to decline. Domestic consumption faced challenges as well, with weak housing and auto markets. Coming up after the break, 80 years after the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, questions remain over how many Taiwanese soldiers fought and died there.
For more stories from Taiwan and around the world, download the TaiwanPlus app.
In the face of adversity, the power of truth.
A roadmap for a just and open world, charted by the freest country in Asia.
Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
TaiwanPlus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.
Welcome back. You're watching TaiwanPlus News. Lawmakers have passed a draft amendment meant to change the name and target groups of priority seats on public transportation. Irene Lin has the story.
Here at Taipei Metro train, you will see the sign that says passengers should yield the seat to the elderly, pregnant, disabled, and those who travel with babies and children. But that may be about to change.
Taiwan's legislature has passed a draft amendment that aims to remove the specific references to the elderly, women, and children on metros, buses, and trains in the law. The goal is to be more inclusive, recognizing the needs of people with disabilities and anyone who may have invisible discomfort or illnesses. The amendment also proposes changing its Chinese name to a more inclusive term to match with its English translation. The original name, 博爱, translates to benevolence and stems from a core philosophy in Chinese history. It's meant to promote universal love and care for one another. While the name and its target groups was well intended, they were often twisted by passengers to use against each other. Footage of conflicts erupting on public transport commonly circulates online. Often they involve debate over who should be prioritized and whether some people should occupy the seats. Many passengers do yield these seats when they see someone in need, but too often the signs of someone in need are unclear.
就是有坐在优先座的人，就是他应该就是有需要坐在那个位置，所以我不会判定说他的身体状况好不好，或他的年纪大或小，然后可不可以坐那个位置。
Some think it's people's behavior that needs to change.
其实我觉得都一样哎，因为博爱座就是给那个老弱妇孺或是受伤的人坐的，啊，你优先坐的话，现在很多年轻人基本上想坐就坐了，他也不会让座，只顾着看手机、滑手机什么的。
But for groups who fight for disability rights, it's still a symbolic improvement.
反而是一些比较隐性的障碍，比如说因为洗肾或是癌症、体能衰退这个部分，那大家可能反而不知道要怎么让，因此改成优先席，我觉得是一个很好的做法，让有需要的人能够提出来，不见只是身心障碍者而已。所以希望大家能够在政府的宣导之下，多了解说博爱座它是一个互相帮忙、互相体谅的设置，而不是说给某些人的保留座。
The amendment is still going through the legislature. If it's passed, lawmakers say the Transportation Ministry should standardize the signage on all public transportation.
While lawmakers are working to rebrand priority seats, allowing more people to enjoy the service, the ultimate goal is for everyone using public transit to be more kind to each other and to share the space in peace. Joseph Wu and Irene Lin in Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is warning that Beijing's military buildup could drag Russia and Europe into a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait.
And we are all very worried, of course, about the situation in Taiwan. And we also know that there is a risk that if the Chinese would try anything with Taiwan, that no doubt he will call his junior partner, Mr. Putin, and make sure that the junior partner in that relationship with China, Mr. Putin, will keep us busy here.
Rutte made the remarks ahead of the NATO summit in The Hague. He stressed the alliance's close ties in the Asia-Pacific and the allies Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand are also concerned about China's military expansion. At the summit, NATO members will commit to increasing defense spending to 5% of their country's GDP, a key demand from U.S. President Donald Trump. But some fear U.S. strikes on Iran could overshadow the meeting. And for more on the NATO summit and what it could mean for the Asia-Pacific region, Alec McDonald spoke to Bryce Barrows, Associate Fellow at the NGO GlobeSec.
What is the importance of this NATO summit to the Asia-Pacific region? And likewise, what is the importance of Asia-Pacific to NATO?
The NATO summit unto itself is very important. And NATO, in the last few years, especially since the 2022 strategic concept, has really noted that the Indo-Pacific is a priority for them because of the linkages between the two regions, right? And it goes not only from the idea that you have a larger neighbor invading a smaller neighbor and what those parallels might mean for the Indo-Pacific, but also just like longstanding strategic concerns, right? So if you're in Tokyo, historically your biggest great power rival going back a century and a half or more has not been China per se, but it's been the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and now to a lesser extent, or depending on who you talk to, in Tokyo, the Russian Federation, right? To a lesser extent compared to what the threats that are posed by North Korea and China. So I think trying to drive those linkages are really important. And it's not just something that, looks good, feels good. It comes down to making sure that you're, maintaining strong intelligence sharing.
So Secretary General Mark Rutte said that a Taiwan Strait crisis could draw in Europe into such a conflict if Beijing calls upon Russia. How realistic is such a situation, and what would be the consequences if this happens?
I think from a battlefield perspective, it's very unlikely you're going to see you will not see coordinated NATO organizational involvement. I think what you will see is potentially contributions from different member states, depending on the context of what that sort of conflict looks like, right? And obviously, Secretary General Rutte's sort of comments were right to raise the alarm, as in that Europe cannot afford to see the Taiwan Strait sort of situation as a distant issue. And there's an evolving, strategic entente between not only Russia and China, but also North Korea, and it's tightening. For example, Russia has conducted joint patrols, like bomber patrols around Japan. That happens every once in a while. There's a possibility of future trilateral exercises between North Korea, China, and Russia, which also can serve as a strategic distraction and a pressure point in the event of a Taiwan crisis.
So with the Asia-Pacific region being so important to NATO, then how significant is it that South Korea, Australia, and Japan will be skipping out on this summit?
So I think the optics don't look good, even if Iran is not the only factor. I would highlight that for at least Japan and South Korea, that's not an insignificant reason for them to want to bow out. It's important to remember how much oil Japan and South Korea both receive from the Middle East. Any sort of crisis related to oil in the spot market directly impacts those economies a lot, much more than Australia directly, given that Australia also has its own really strong oil production capacity, and is involved in doing that in places around the Indo-Pacific, for example, like Brunei and other sort of parts of the region. So I do think the absence of U.S. allies, from the IP4, with the exception of Prime Minister Chris Luxon of New Zealand, could hint a little bit at fractures in coordination and trust. However, that doesn't take away from things that are happening at the working level, right?
So with the war between Iran and Israel, which, as we are talking, is very much in fluctuation, what sort of talking points could that raise at the NATO summit?
So NATO puts a big emphasis, or rather, I shouldn't say that NATO as a whole does, but parts of the NATO sort of alliance structure, so member states, put a large emphasis on what they view as the South, right? So that includes discussions related to migration through the Mediterranean for southern member NATO states, right? Like Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, etc. So whatever sort of outflows from this sort of conflict that could happen related to migration, related to broader instability across the Middle East, that is always a concern for those particular member states of NATO. There's also a fear that it could distract a little bit from broader sort of pushes within NATO and the European Union to support Ukraine, which is something that I think is very much notable. Some of the other sort of aspects that could come from this too.
That was Bryce Barrows, Associate Fellow at GlobeSec. The Battle of Okinawa, the last major campaign of World War II, was one of the first to involve significant numbers of Taiwanese troops. In part 2 of our special report marking the anniversary of the end of the battle, Bryn Thomas looks at why so many of their names, stories, and remains have not been accounted for.
The Battle of Okinawa was the bloodiest fight of the Pacific War, and the first time significant numbers of Taiwanese were sent into combat. But their role in that battle has almost vanished from historical records. We know nearly 13,000 Americans were killed, and more than 110,000 Japanese troops died. And somewhere among them were Taiwanese conscripts, fighting and dying under the flag of the Empire of Japan. But how many? Well, no one knows for sure. Today, just 34 Taiwanese names are engraved on a memorial in Okinawa, a number most historians say barely scratches the surface.
所以这个在整个加起来，根据那个冲绳大学那一位教授叫右吉圣清教授，他的那个记录来讲，他认为至少应该破1000人，在冲绳死亡的台湾人应该要破1000人，但是所以说这个还需要再继续清查。那因为台湾人就是说战后其实跟冲绳是隔离的状态啦。
Both Taiwan and Okinawa were part of the Japanese Empire during the war, and Taiwanese war dead were recorded alongside other Japanese casualties.
那在冲绳战争里面，其实，我们在台湾之塔目前看到的是34个台湾人的名字被刻在上面。那当年应该是因为通常来讲会被刻在上面，但是又没有家属提出那个刻名字的需求的时候，通常都是他们在一些那个作战部队的名单里面找到的名字是那种3个字的，是那种那个中式的姓名。
After the war, when control of Taiwan was handed over to the Republic of China, those records, the ones that weren't destroyed, remained in Japan.
其实台湾人最参战最完整的这个资料是在日本本土，但是如果台湾这边没有官方相对应的官方的机构去申请把这些资料抄回台湾的话，那基本上我们都只能够靠这种那个口访记录或者是家属的一些那个口述才知道说可能某些人在海外战死，但是没有什么资料会留下来。
The nature of the fighting on Okinawa has made recovering remains extremely difficult. Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians were often forced to fight to the death in caves or kill themselves, sometimes with their families, rather than surrender.
As the war goes further north and gets closer to Japan and we get to this, greater level of savagery that the war had become, the Americans are using more and more of one of humanity's oldest weapons, flames, fire. And what I mean is, of course, the flame tanks that I mentioned, but the flamethrower teams, strap the tank to your back, and here you are with that hose, and you're just hosing down caves or any other fighting position.
Against some of the most fanatical opposition ever encountered, the Americans blast their way forward grenade by grenade. The whole island is honeycombed with defenses, and the enemy has to be ferreted out one at a time.
80 years after the war, the remains of dozens of people are still found each year. Some are soldiers, others are among the more than 100,000 civilians killed during the battle, roughly a third of Okinawa's wartime population. Around 1,400 sets of remains are unclaimed, awaiting identification through DNA testing.
It was absolutely such a mess in 1945 that I think it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it. It's an environmental mess, how battered that landscape was, and on top of it, the weather, of course, the rain had created quagmires of mud. A lot of the Japanese are underground, and so, they experience subterranean deaths, or they're sealed in caves.
A mop-up team using phosphorus, flame, and small arms fire reduces a camouflaged Japanese position.
In the aftermath of a battle, and later the entire war, U.S. forces quickly shifted from combat to humanitarian efforts. Japan turned its focus to rebuilding, and in Taiwan, political realities, like the Chinese Civil War and the Cold War, took precedence. There was little appetite to confront inconvenient truths, especially the possibility that Taiwanese troops took part in war crimes and atrocities. No side had the political will to fully reckon with the past.
Nobody's big concern was in the immediate aftermath commemoration and, figuring out remains and all that, unless it's their own. Their idea was let's move on. Everybody's idea was let's move on. And if you're Okinawan, the idea is I'm just happy I survived.
而且那个台湾这边的政府基本上也不鼓励，甚至会去阻止台湾人去处理这个战前的这些相关的这些资讯，也就是代表说很多的那个战没者他的遗嘱他没办法去找说他的家人是在哪边战死的，也没办法去了解说，就是说去跟那个冲绳县政府去跟他们提起这种需求，就是说可能能不能把名字刻在上面。
80 years on, the World War II generation is fading. Taiwanese now join Okinawa memorials, reading the names of their war dead. A small but overdue tribute, yet many questions remain unanswered. The full number of Taiwanese who served and died is still a historical mystery. And advocates press Japan to release wartime records, while urging Taiwan to confront and fully reckon with its past.
等上一辈的结束了，下一辈如果说对这段历史不了解，这段历史就完全就是从我们的记忆里面，那个国族记忆里面就会被整个移除掉。所以我们为什么要去带团，每年带团去参加这个冲人的纪念仪式？其实也是让这个团员参加的，因为参加团员是来自台湾各个阶层、各个领域的一些专家，我们让他们看一下。
The Second World War remains the most important story in modern history. Yet, in one of its final chapters, the Battle of Okinawa, the deaths of Taiwanese soldiers remain a mystery. Without working to uncover and preserve this past, knowledge of Taiwan's role in the world's biggest conflict risks being lost forever. James Lin, Ed Moon, Jeffrey Chen, and Bryn Thomas for TaiwanPlus.
You can watch the full video on Taiwan's role in the Battle of Okinawa at TaiwanPlus.com or our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching TaiwanPlus News. Finally, we're heading to Mexico City. More than 1,000 people there used colored umbrellas to form a giant LGBTQ flag in celebration of Pride Month. I'm Yvonne Yang. Take care, and I'll see you next time.